The feeling of being watched is often dismissed as a trick of the mind, a primal glitch in our internal wiring. But for Christelle Krug, the static in the air was real. It began not with a shadow in an alleyway or a heavy breather on the phone, but with the quiet, rhythmic pulse of a digital notification. A text from an unknown number. Then another. A comment on a social media post that felt too intimate, too knowing. In the suburban quiet of Broomfield, Colorado, the walls of a beautiful home were beginning to feel porous. Christelle, a high-functioning chemical engineer and a mother of 3, was a woman of logic. She dealt in formulas and certainties. But there is no formula for the sensation of a ghost standing right behind you. And there is no certainty when the intruder is already inside your network. This is the story of a woman who did everything right, who documented every threat, who built a fortress of evidence to save her children, only to realize that the monster wasn't hiding in the bushes. He was hiding in the router. September in Colorado usually brings a crisp, predictable shift in the season. But in 2023, the air in the Krug household was heavy with a different kind of tension. It started with a digital sweep. Christelle began noticing anomalies. Her passwords didn't work. Accounts she hadn't accessed in years were suddenly active. Then came the messages. They weren't just threats, they were psychological scalpels. The sender knew her schedule. They knew what she wore to the grocery store. They knew the names of her children. The primary suspect was obvious. Or so it seemed. Jack Anthony Holland, an ex-boyfriend from a lifetime ago. A name from a high school yearbook that had suddenly clawed its way back into her present. Christelle told the police she was certain it was him. The digital footprint seemed to scream his name. Emails arrived from addresses that were variations of his identity. The harassment escalated from digital pings to real-world terror. On a Tuesday afternoon, Christelle walked into the Broomfield Police Department. Her gait was steady, but her eyes told a different story. She wasn't just there to report a crime, she was there to provide a dossier. She had logs. She had screenshots. She had a timeline that would make a detective's head spin. She told the officers that she felt like she was being hunted. "It's a lot," she whispered to the investigator, her voice cracking for the first time. "It has made me paranoid everywhere I go." The police took it seriously. They had to. This wasn't just a disgruntled ex. This was a campaign of annihilation. They advised her to change her patterns. They suggested more security. Her husband, Dan Krug, was the picture of the protective partner. He was the one who climbed the ladders to install the high-definition Ring cameras. He was the one who sat with her on the sofa, scrolling through the footage, looking for a glimpse of a figure in the dark. He was her rock, her tech support, and her witness. But the cameras captured nothing. No shadows darting across the lawn. No hooded figures at the gate. And yet, the messages continued. They became more graphic, more frequent. The stalker began posting sexually explicit solicitations online using Christelle's name and phone number. Total strangers began showing up at her door, lured by the digital breadcrumbs left by a ghost. Christelle was trapped in a digital panopticon. She was being watched by eyes she couldn't see, through lenses she couldn't find. She began to wonder if she was losing her mind. How could someone be everywhere and nowhere at once? How could they know her every move if the cameras showed a clear perimeter? As the winter frost began to settle over Broomfield, the digital noise reached a fever pitch. The stalker wasn't just targeting Christelle anymore. He was sending threats to Dan. He was threatening the children. The circle was closing. On the morning of December 14th, the sun rose over a house that had become a bunker. At 8:56 a.m., a text message left Christelle's phone. It was a mundane check into her husband. A sign of life. A final digital pulse. When the police arrived for a welfare check just an hour later, they found the house silent. The garage door was shut. The cameras were active, but when Officer O'Hara managed to peer through a high window into the garage, the silence was broken by the sight of something slumped on the floor. The digital ghost had finally taken a physical form, and the evidence Christile had been so carefully gathering was about to tell a story she never lived to finish. To understand the terror that gripped Christile Krug, one must understand the ghost she was fighting. His name was Jack Anthony Holland, or at least, that was the name on the digital envelope. Jack was a relic from Christile's past, a high school boyfriend from decades ago. In the logic of a criminal mind, an ex-boyfriend is the perfect silhouette to cast upon a wall. He represents a known quantity, a history of emotion, and a plausible motive for obsession. For months, Christile lived under the assumption that Jack had crawled out of the archives of her life to dismantle her present. The psychological warfare was sophisticated. It didn't just target Christile's peace of mind, it targeted her reputation. This is a specific kind of cruelty, a digital assassination of character. Imagine waking up to find that your name, your face, and your private phone number have been plastered across the dark corners of the internet. The stalker created ads on adult classified sites, posing as Christile, inviting strangers to her home for no strings attached encounters. Suddenly, the threat wasn't just a buzzing phone. It was the sound of a strange car idling in the driveway at 2 a.m. It was the heavy knock of a confused man at the front door, showing a smartphone screen with Christile's face on it, asking if she was ready. Christile was a woman of science, a chemical engineer used to solving for $x. But in this equation, $x was a moving target. She did what any rational person would do. She documented. She kept a stalking log, a chillingly precise record of every digital intrusion. Every time a new Jack Holland email address appeared in her inbox, Jack Holland 82, J Holland Secure, she noted the timestamp, the IP address, and the content. The content was designed to make her feel naked. I saw what you wore today, one message read. The blue blouse suits you, but I prefer the red one you wore yesterday. The implication was clear. I am always there. I am the air you breathe. Dan Krug was right there beside her, the vigilant protector. He was the one who checked the locks. He was the one who comforted her when the police said there wasn't enough evidence to arrest Jack yet. Because that was the problem with the digital trail, it led everywhere and nowhere. The IP addresses were masked by VPNs. The phone numbers were burners, temporary digital shells that evaporated after use. Yet, there were moments where the stalker's reach seemed supernatural. One afternoon, Christile received an email containing a photograph of herself. Not a public photo, but a candid shot taken from a distance while she was in her own backyard. The message attached was simple. You look tired, Christile. You should rest. The walls of her home, once a sanctuary for her 3 children, had become transparent. She began to cover the lenses of her laptops with tape. She drew the curtains even in the midday sun. The digital sweep she performed on her devices came back clean, yet the hacks continued. What Christile didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly calculated, was that the digital footprint wasn't coming from an outsider breaking in. It was being generated by an insider looking out. The police reached out to Jack Holland. They tracked him down in another state. He was cooperative. He was confused. He hadn't spoken to Christile in years. He had an alibi for every moment of the harassment. But the messages kept coming, often while Jack was being interviewed by investigators hundreds of miles away. This is where the unseen narrative takes a darker turn. The stalker began to pivot. The threats weren't just for Christile anymore. They began to target Dan. I'm coming for your husband next, the emails warned. I'm going to take everything from you. In a twisted display of solidarity, Dan showed Christine his own phone. He, too, was receiving threats. He, too, was a victim. They were in this together, a family under siege, huddled in a house that had become a glass box. But as the pressure mounted, Christine's engineering mind began to notice small, discordant notes. Why did the stalker always know when she was alone? Why did the security cameras she and Dan installed together always seem to glitch or reboot during the exact minutes the stalker claimed to be watching her from the porch? She began to wonder if the ghost in the machine wasn't a person at all, but a script. A pre-programmed sequence of terror. The transition from a home to a fortress is a subtle, agonizing process. It begins with a second deadbolt. Then, a security sign in the yard. Finally, the cameras. By November, the Krug residence was bristling with lenses. Christine and Dan had spent hours choosing the right system. They settled on a sophisticated network of ring cameras and internal monitors. It was supposed to be the ultimate deterrent. If Jack Holland, or whoever this digital shadow was, stepped foot on the property, his face would be captured in high definition, time-stamped, and uploaded to the cloud. But the invisible stalker seemed to possess a ghostly fluency with their security. The harassment reached a terrifying new frequency. It wasn't just emails anymore, it was a total digital siege. Christine would receive a notification that her front door camera had detected motion, but when she checked the live feed, the driveway was empty. Seconds later, a text would arrive. "I see you looking at the screen, Christine. You look scared." The psychological toll was devastating. Christine, the engineer, the woman who relied on data, was being told by her own data that she was alone, while the messages insisted she was being touched. She began to doubt the very hardware she had installed to protect her children. She reached out to tech support. She ran diagnostic sweeps. Everything appeared normal. In late November, the escalation took a physical turn. Christine reported to the police that she had found a tracking device near her car. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation. This wasn't just a remote hacker. This was someone with physical access to her world. The police increased their patrols. Detectives began a more aggressive shadow operation, following Christine as she ran errands, hoping to catch the stalker in the act of following her. But the stalker was always one step ahead. He would message her. "Tell the gray sedan to back off. They aren't going to save you." He knew the unmarked police cars. He knew the shifts. Inside the home, the atmosphere was suffocating. Dan was the tech support husband, constantly resetting routers, changing Wi-Fi passwords, and checking the logs. He was the one who suggested they keep a physical log of every incident, separate from the digital one, just in case their devices were compromised. Christine took this advice to heart. She began leaving clues, not just in the stalking log she shared with police, but in the way she organized her digital life. She started tagging certain files, hidden in folders with mundane names. It was a failsafe. If the logic of the world failed her, she would leave a trail of breadcrumbs that only a forensic mind could follow. The unseen element of this case is the sheer isolation. Even with a husband by her side and the police on speed dial, Christine was on an island. The stalker had managed to cut her off from her own sense of reality. Then came the timed selfie. One evening, Dan came home white-faced. He showed Christine a photo he had just received on his phone. It was a picture of him, taken from behind, as he walked from his car to his office. The message attached said, "If I can get him, I can get the kids." This was the breaking point. The threat had moved from Christine to the people she loved most. The fortress had failed. The cameras were useless. The police were blind. In the final days of November, Christine made a decision. If the system was being hacked, She would bypass the system. She began recording her own thoughts, her own suspicions, in a private diary. She noted how strange it was that the glitches in the Wi-Fi always happened when Dan was home or just leaving. She noted how the stalker's tone sometimes shifted, becoming less like an obsessed ex-boyfriend and more like someone who knew the intimate frustrations of her marriage. She was starting to see the silhouette in the static. The morning of December 14, 2023, began with the same eerie, clinical precision that had defined the past 3 months. The sun hit the frost-covered rooftops of Broomfield, but inside the Krug residence, the air was stagnant. Daniel Krug left for work early. He was a man of routine, a man who understood that an alibi is built not just with words, but with the steady, documented movement of a phone through a city. He checked his cameras. He kissed his family. He drove away. At 8:56 a.m., Christiel's phone came to life. A single text message was sent to Dan. It was a mundane domestic ping, a check-in, a heartbeat in digital form. To anyone looking at the logs later, it would serve as the definitive, last seen, moment. A proof of life that placed Christiel alive and well in her home long after her husband had swiped his badge at work. But silence has a way of sounding an alarm. By mid-morning, the usual rhythm of communication between Christiel and her family had flatlined. No replies to follow-up texts. No activity on her professional accounts. A welfare check was requested. When Officer O'Hara pulled his cruiser into the driveway, the house looked undisturbed. The Ring cameras, those silent, unblinking sentinels, were in place. The garage door was shut tight. O'Hara walked the perimeter. He knocked. He called out. Nothing. It was then that he noticed the windows on the garage door. They were positioned high, just out of a standard line of sight. It was a design choice for privacy, but in this moment, it was a barrier to the truth. O'Hara didn't hesitate. He pulled his patrol car up the driveway, right against the garage door, and used the hood as a ladder. He climbed up and peered through the glass into the dim light of the garage. In the unseen world of true crime, there is a specific kind of horror in the mundane. A garage is a place for tools, for bicycles, for the clutter of a life in progress. But there, on the concrete floor, lay Christiel. She wasn't just dead, she had been executed. The scene was violent, chaotic, and final. The initial shock for the first responders was punctuated by a chilling realization. The invisible stalker had finally breached the walls. The Jack Holland threat had materialized. When Dan Krug arrived back at the scene, he was the picture of a man destroyed. He collapsed in the street, his grief a raw, public spectacle. He told the officers about the months of torment. He pointed to the cameras he had installed. He showed them the 8:56 a.m. text, his proof that he was gone and she was safe when the day began. The police immediately pivoted to a manhunt for Jack Holland. They went to his home. They checked his workplace. They looked for the man who had been the lead character in Christiel's nightmare for 3 months. But as the forensic team began to process the garage, the invariant facts started to clash with the narrative. There was no sign of forced entry. The security system, the one Dan and Christiel had meticulously maintained, had recorded nothing. No stranger at the door. No hooded figure in the garage. Even more disturbing was the nature of the crime itself. This wasn't a crime of digital obsession, it was a crime of physical proximity. As the investigators stood in the cold garage, they began to look at the 8:56 a.m. text message again. In the world of chemical engineering, every reaction has a catalyst. In a murder investigation, every digital timestamp is a potential lie. They realized that the invisible stalker hadn't just been watching Christiel. He had been narrating her life. And the 8:56 a.m. text wasn't a sign of life at all. It was a digital ghost, a scheduled ghost, sent by a phone that was already sitting in a house of secrets. The investigation was about to turn inward. The lenses of the cameras were being turned around, away from the street and toward the man who had installed them. The transition from grieving widower to lead suspect is rarely a sudden leap. It is a slow, methodical erosion of a persona. As Daniel Krug sat in the interview room, his face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow, the detectives across from him weren't looking at his tears. They were looking at the data. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery in the garage, Dan was the investigation's greatest ally. He provided passwords, pointed toward Jack Holland, and recounted every terrifying digital intrusion. But as the forensic team processed the Krug household, a different kind of digital sweep was taking place. The first crack appeared in the very system Dan had installed to protect his family. Investigators pulled the logs for the Ring cameras and the home's Wi-Fi router. They expected to see a sophisticated hack, a bypass executed by a brilliant, distant stalker. Instead, they found something far more manual. On the nights when the most aggressive messages were sent to Chris Steele, the router logs showed a series of intentional reboots and administrative overrides. These weren't the actions of a remote ghost. They were the actions of someone with physical access to the hardware. Someone who knew the admin password. Then there was the matter of the stalker's eyes. Detectives revisited the candid photos Chris Steele had received, the ones that made her feel watched in her own backyard. They performed a line-of-sight analysis. To take those photos, a stalker would have had to be standing in a specific spot at a specific angle. When they mapped it out, they realized the person taking the photos wasn't hiding in the woods or a neighbor's yard. They were standing on the back porch. The forensic team then turned their attention to the burner numbers used to harass Chris Steele. Through a series of digital subpoenas to TextNow and Verizon, they traced the purchase of the credits used to power those anonymous accounts. The trail didn't lead to a high school ex-boyfriend in another state. It led to a local target. The security footage from that target showed a man purchasing a gift card with cash. He was wearing a hat and sunglasses, but the gait was unmistakable. It was Daniel Krug. The most devastating blow to Dan's narrative, however, came from the 8:56 a.m. text message, his ironclad alibi. Digital forensics is a cold, unforgiving science. When experts analyzed Chris Steele's phone, they didn't just see the message, they saw the metadata. They discovered that the text hadn't been typed and sent in real time. It had been scheduled using a third-party automation app. It was a digital time bomb, set to go off while Dan was safely miles away at work, creating the illusion that Chris Steele was still alive, still checking in, still safe. When confronted with these inconsistencies, the protective husband began to shift. His stories became more complex, more defensive. He spoke about the stress of the stalking, suggesting that perhaps he had bought the burner phones to test the security system, or to understand how the stalker was operating. It was a desperate attempt to retroactively fit the facts into his crumbling lie. But the police found one more piece of evidence that Dan couldn't explain away. Hidden in a digital vault on his own computer was a folder of photos. They weren't just photos of Chris Steele, they were photos of himself. Remember the timed selfie that had sent Dan into a panic? The photo of him being followed to work? The metadata revealed the truth. Dan hadn't been followed. He had set his phone on a tripod, set a timer, and walked away from it to capture a picture of his own back. He was stalking himself to validate the fear he was feeding his wife. As the detectives laid the evidence out on the table, the atmospheric horror of the invisible stalker evaporated. There was no ghost. There was only a husband who had spent months gaslighting his wife, building a digital cage around her, and using her own fear as a weapon to mask his final, violent intent. The tragedy of Christine Krug is not just a story of a murder. It is a story of a brilliant mind fighting an invisible war with the only weapons she had: logic and data. As investigators combed through Christine's digital life, they realized she had been doing more than just documenting harassment. She was a chemical engineer. She understood systems. She understood that even in a chaotic chemical reaction, there are markers that reveal the truth. In the final weeks of her life, Christine's stalking log had become a masterpiece of forensic breadcrumbs. She had started to notice a pattern that the police had initially missed. Every time she reached out to an IT professional or a security firm to sweep her house for bugs, the stalker would mock her for it within minutes. "I know you called the tech guy," the anonymous email would say. "He won't find me." Christine realized that the only way the stalker could know her phone calls in real time was if the bug wasn't a physical device hidden in a wall, but a compromise of the communication system itself. She began to suspect the man who managed that system. Her husband. She didn't confront him. She knew that in a house filled with cameras and microphones, a confrontation would be a death sentence. Instead, she began to hide her true thoughts in the one place Dan wouldn't look: the trash and archive folders of her professional engineering accounts. She used her work laptop, the only device Dan didn't have administrative access to log her growing suspicions. She wrote about the glitches in the Ring cameras. She noted that whenever Dan went to the basement to check the router, the stalking messages spiked in intensity. She even recorded a conversation where Dan tried to convince her that she was suffering from a mental break, and that the stalker was a manifestation of her own anxiety. This is the ultimate form of betrayal, the domestic gaslight. Dan wasn't just trying to kill her, he was trying to make her believe she was insane before he did. The motive began to crystallize for investigators as they looked into the Krugs' finances and personal life. Behind the suburban perfection of their Broomfield home, the marriage was a hollow shell. Dan wanted out, but he didn't want a divorce. A divorce meant a split of assets, a fight for the children, and a public admission of failure. In Dan's warped, technical mind, a digital stalker was the perfect exit strategy. If Christine were killed by a crazed, obsessed ex-boyfriend, Dan would be the tragic widower. He would keep the house, the insurance, the children, and the sympathy of the community. He had spent 3 months carefully building the character of Jack Holland, the villain of the story, so that he could step in as the hero who failed to save her. But he had underestimated the woman he married. The most damning piece of unseen evidence was a file Christine had saved just 48 hours before her death. It was a screenshot of her home Wi-Fi's connected devices list. She had highlighted an unfamiliar device, a MAC address that didn't belong to any of their phones or tablets. Using her engineering skills, she had traced that address. It belonged to a text now burner phone. And that phone was currently drawing power from the outlet in Dan's home office. She knew. In those final 48 hours, Christine Krug knew that the monster was in the house. She knew that every "I love you" from her husband was a lie. She knew the 8:56 a.m. text was coming. She couldn't save herself in time, but she made sure that when the police walked into that garage, they wouldn't just see a victim. They would see a crime scene that she had already solved for them. The courtroom in Broomfield was not filled with the typical sounds of a high-profile murder trial. There were no outbursts, no dramatic confessions. Instead, there was the steady, rhythmic clicking of a mouse and the dry, clinical testimony of digital forensic experts. They weren't just presenting evidence. They were narrating the final months of a woman who had spent her life measuring the invisible world of molecules, only to be forced to measure the invisible world of her husband's malice. When the prosecution presented the digital sweep evidence, the gravity of Dan Krug's deception became suffocating. The jury watched as the timeline was laid out, a 3-month descent where every stalking incident was perfectly mirrored by activity on Dan's workplace computer or his personal devices. They saw the receipts for the gift cards. They saw the timed selfie. And then, they saw the metadata of the 8:56 a.m. text. That single timestamp, once Dan's greatest shield, became his greatest indictment. It was a digital ghost, a scheduled performance that proved the murder was not a crime of passion, but a crime of engineering. Dan had treated his wife's life like a technical problem to be solved, a variable to be removed from the equation. As the verdict was read, the silence in the room was absolute. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, stalking, criminal impersonation. The judge looked at Daniel Krug, the man who thought he could hide behind a router and a VPN, and delivered a sentence as cold and final as the concrete floor in that garage. Life without the possibility of parole. But the true ending of this story doesn't happen in a prison cell. It happens in the quiet legacy Christine Krug left behind. Christine was a mother of 3. She was a daughter. She was a scientist. In her final moments, she chose not to be a victim, but to be an investigator. She used her training, her meticulous nature, and her unwavering love for her children to leave a map for the police. She knew that if she couldn't escape, she could at least ensure that the truth would survive. Today, Christine's children live with her parents, surrounded by the love and security their mother fought so hard to provide. They are growing up in a world that is safer because of her foresight. The case of Christine Krug is a haunting reminder that in the modern age, the most dangerous weapon isn't always a blade or a gun. Sometimes, it's the device in your hand. But it's also a testament to the power of the human spirit. Logic can be used to destroy, but it can also be used to expose the darkness. As the cameras in the courtroom finally flickered off, the invisible stalker was gone. The static had cleared, and through the mountain of data, the text logs, and the forensic sweeps, one truth remained. Christine Krug had outsmarted her killer. She had documented her own tragedy so clearly that no shadow could hide the man responsible. The ghost was finally given a name, and the mother who left the clues behind had finally saved her children.